Wonderful. Good afternoon and welcome to all of those who have joined. I am Michael Todori, president of the Washington Foreign Law Society. The Washington Foreign Law Society was founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, comparative legal issues, and foreign law. The Washington Foreign Law Society serves as a forum for discussion among legal professionals serving in public and private capacities in an array of different organizations, including international organizations, law firms, the U.S. government, foreign missions, NGOs, academic institutions, and many, many more. We are truly privileged and lucky to be joined today by Mr. Kurt Donnelly, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Diplomacy, a position he held until October of last year, 2021. Prior to his return to Washington, Mr. Donnelly served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade, Serbia. His other assignments include the U.S. mission to NATO, Afghanistan, Turkey, Hungary, Russia, Germany, the National Security Council, Director of the State Department Office for International Religious Freedom, and Director for Central Asian Affairs. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. As a reminder, this session will be recorded and will be available on our website after this. Participants will be able to communicate with us via the Q&A section, which I'll be monitoring through my computer here. So please send any questions you may have using the Q&A feature on your screen, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the session. And finally, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Our Twitter handle is @WFLS1952. Mr. Donnelly, again, it's terrific to have you here with us. Why don't we start with a brief introduction. When did you know you wanted to become a diplomat?
I didn't really quite know. I was always interested in international relations and just like travel. So foreign cultures and had always intrigued me. I was a history major in college, so I was really intrigued by learning about the history of other countries around the world and trying to learn from that. I was working at a small consulting firm. And a colleague of mine said, let's take the foreign service exam. And I said, well, why not? So it wasn't anything that I conceived in my head as a child or a young man or a college graduate or anything else like that. It was sort of happenstance. And ended up being in the State Department for 33 years, something I wouldn't have expected at all.
You've had an extensive and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. We've mentioned all the postings you've been in. Do you have a favorite posting or perhaps one of the ones that was most challenging to you?
So my wife would hardly disagree, but I really enjoyed my posting. My second posting in the Foreign Service was in Moscow, Russia, during the Yeltsin days, so 1993 to 1995. I learned the Russian language, don't speak it very well anymore, which is a beautiful language, and enjoyed that. Was really enthralled by Russian culture and literature and all the rest. But we happened to get there during a time of terrible instability and turbulence, and moved into our embassy housing right across from the Russian White House in the fall of 1993, just at the time when there was an uprising by insurrection, for lack of a better word, that was headquartered right across the street from where my wife and my two children and I lived. It was a very, very difficult time for us. We were in actually very great danger, and a number of people a couple of our guards were killed. There were people in the area around us. There was a lot of fighting going on. Having said all that, that's why my wife wasn't very happy about living in Russia. Having said all that, I got to see things in Russia that American diplomats had never had the opportunity to do before. Go to places and to really understand more about this still very important country and learn the culture. It was a wonderful and challenging assignment. The most challenging assignment. So that was rewarding and challenging both. The most rewarding assignment I had was as a Deputy Chief of Mission in Serbia. To be involved in running an embassy and diplomatic missions is great on a whole number of levels. One of the more difficult jobs I had, which I really loved, was working at the National Security it just requires so much of your time and energy that it can be. It's just it's a difficult job. It's rewarding. You get to have access to people and to decision making that you dream about if you're interested in foreign policy. But it was quite a challenge.
Let's shift gears a little bit. America's foreign policy posture and position on the global stage have changed significantly over the past number of years and over the past decade due to internal and external forces as well. How do you assess that change from your vantage point as somebody who's been involved in diplomacy at the highest levels for many years?
So from the external standpoint, the world is an uncertain, changing place. So unfortunately, there have been some enormous developments in the world that I think there was a lot of optimism about initially. Russia, the emergence, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the liberation of countries in Eastern Europe, an opportunity for Russia to take a very different approach to government, to democracy, to human rights, and all those things, and a chance to really develop as a normal, prosperous country that delivers for its own people. The emergence of China, something that I think we were all excited to see happen. That China over the last decades really turned the corner, and you saw tremendous economic growth and tremendous development of what was an enormous yet backward country for so long. As we've seen, it's presented very different challenges. I look to something like the Arab Spring. So much optimism about a part of the world that had been so, frankly, backward. A lot of autocratic governments, a lot of repression of human rights and things like religious freedom and other things. And we really saw an opportunity for the people of the region to express their displeasure with these autocratic regimes that were in place, and the desire to have democracy, the desire to have more exposure to the rest of the world, be much more of an integral part of the world community. And unfortunately, that didn't work out as well as we had hoped either. I haven't given up on that, and I haven't given up on China or Russia. I think that there are still lots of things. There are good people who are still fighting a good fight, who have a vision for their societies, of a better place to live for themselves, for their children, and to be a contributing part of the global community. But those were huge developments, and they were difficult developments. Domestically, we've gone through some real swings in our own domestic politics. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we had the end of history, where we all patted ourselves on the back and said, this is going to usher in an era of prosperity and democracy, and everybody agrees that the American vision for the world has won. That didn't work out, which is unfortunate because there were huge opportunities there that didn't happen. But the result for us in the United States, I think, was a bit of hubris. We thought that we had the answer, and the answer to the world's problems is do as the Americans. And that's simplistic. It just doesn't always work. Which is why we have diplomats who go live in a foreign country and try and understand the politics and the culture and the history, and inform decision makers in Washington. Yes, here's our goal. Here's, in this situation, here's how we get to it. But one size doesn't fit all. We're talking about international relations. So those are some of the big swings that have happened. We can talk about all sorts of things in the global economy, which have transformed the way that we do almost everything. Social media, how that's affected our sense of security in the United States and other countries around the world. The global economy, the internet, all of these things have led to enormous changes domestically and internationally. So it's been exciting and sometimes scary last couple of decades, but more to do.
Let me drill down on one point that I think will particularly interest our audience here of legal practitioners. One, I think, recurring feature, unfortunately, on the world stage has been increasing democratic and rule of law backsliding in many different parts of the world, with the resurgence of armed conflict as a means of dispute resolution in several parts of the world. And obviously, the U.S. has a role to play in that space. But what role can the U.S. play? There's a number of tools that the U.S. has at its disposal in its toolbox to face these kinds of trends, foreign assistance, more diplomacy, to your point, sanctions. What tools, in your experience, have been most effective to deal with these kinds of situations? And what tools do you think the U.S. will deploy in the future to address these instances?
Yeah, you mentioned the tools. So there's diplomacy, there's military power and deterrence, there's development assistance, there's public diplomacy, and when I say that, what I really think about public diplomacy is international education. So the exchange of people. One of the most powerful programs that the United States has had in the post-war era is a system of exchanges where we brought young people, scholars, politicians to the United States so they can see how we do things. And they go back to their own countries and they understand us better because we have a peculiar system here. We're not a parliamentary system. We have a peculiar history and culture. And the more we understand each other, the better we can work through these issues without it becoming open conflict. It isn't always possible. We fought, 2 world wars in the last century. I think that at least the second one wasn't avoidable. So there are times when military power has to be used. I think one of the mistakes we made, this is not my idea, it's been written about a lot, was the idea that military power could accomplish a number of goals for which it's not well suited. I served in Afghanistan for just a year, but was an observer of what went on there. And the military was asked to do things like build hospitals and do, a lot of functions that are not innate to the military. There are other governmental institutions that do that. USAID can help with development projects. The State Department can do a lot on diplomatic exchanges, information programs, and those kinds of things. I think that we were, and I think we still are, in my opinion, way too dependent or put too much of the burden of our toolbox is on the Pentagon, is on our entire military structure. And that, I think, has led to some bad outcomes.
How about U.S. soft power? Have you seen a decline in the U.S. ability to project soft power across the world? Is that something that is no longer in the toolbox, or that is still there, alive and steady?
So, as I was talking about the exchanges in the post-war era, we still reap enormous benefits from that. I mean, there are prime ministers who, as college students, were involved in exchange programs in the United States, and that kind of understanding is so valuable. But we haven't done as much of that lately as we should. So in the post-war era, I think that the United States really was the dominant soft power in the world. We really exercised it. And we had a very effective story to tell. Because in my experience going around the world, people in other countries know the American story and they value the American story. We're a country of immigrants that has, through thick and thin, stood by our commitment of democracy and human rights. It's not a pretty picture, but we've stuck to it. And I think that had been a bright example to people around the world. So in those times, I think we were very effective at soft power. I don't know if we've gotten worse at it, but we haven't adapted as well to the emergence of new technologies to do this. Unfortunately, Some bad actors have learned very important lessons about the exercise of soft power. So the Russians, the Chinese, for example, they've learned to really manipulate the technologies and sources of soft power in very effective ways. And we've been slow to respond to that. I think we're doing much better, but this is really important. And soft power is essentially education. These are the facts. These are the issues. Here are ways that we can think about it in an open way. The problem is there's so much deception and corruption of our communication now that it's very hard for people to have any confidence when they hear somebody say something. And I'll go back to 2014, the little green men in Crimea. Putin says, I have no idea who these people are. These soldiers that don't have a Russian flag pinned to their vest. They're just sort of popped up in Crimea and they took over. Not my responsibility. Well, he was lying, and he was blatantly lying. But it suited his purposes, and it continues to suit his purposes to corrupt the accuracy of information. It's just lying.
Obviously, this conversation comes in the midst of a very serious crisis at the eastern border of the EU, which would probably deserve an entire session.
Yeah.
And probably won't be touching on that today for the benefit of time, but so we're certainly mindful of that as well. Why don't we switch gears a little bit and move on to your international energy diplomacy efforts? And by the way, I'll remind the audience to please feel free to submit questions to our Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Obviously, you've been involved in international energy policy at the highest level of government. You're heading States Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources. What do you consider the major accomplishments of yourself, of the office you were running during your time as a diplomat, and are there things that you think could have been done better, quicker, things that you think haven't been completed right when you left office?
Yeah. As with anything in government, progress is slow. It's just an institution where change and progress is slow. So there are a lot of things that didn't go as quickly as I would have hoped they would. But I knew that. I knew to expect that. One of the things that I'm proud of, and it really wasn't something that I did, it was my former boss, Frank Fannin, in the Trump administration, really put a sharp focus on this issue of energy resources, the essential minerals and other resources that are necessary for renewable energy. And things like cobalt and lithium, and they were either concentrated and largely under control of, in this case, China, or they were mined in countries that were very unstable, had bad human rights records, bad labor rights records, and these kinds of things. So that what it did was not only did it present the difficulty that these supplies could be manipulated, but it also meant that there could be civil unrest, and all of a sudden half of the world's cobalt supply goes offline for a while. And we've learned about these kinds of issues with other supply chain issues, problems that have emerged in the last year. But that was one thing I think that really raised the focus on this issue. We weren't the only ones by far. There's been a lot of attention on this, but I think I really give a lot of credit to Frank Fannin for what he did, and that was a major initiative in our bureau during his time, and it continues on. I think there's a lot of good work that we've done with individual countries. It's just that hard work of diplomacy of working with individual countries to bring countries along so that we can share with them what our ambitions are and find ways that we can cooperate. And we do that with all sorts of diverse partners. We really removed the cooperation with Europe, with the European Union, which is absolutely essential. We work closely with countries like Japan, Korea, which are traditional allies of ours, and we see things very, very closely. So there's just a lot of hard work that goes into that. Not only to find things that we agree on, but also to understand where we disagree and not let those kinds of issues divert our attention or undermine the cooperation that we have with them. And I was really proud of it. The Energy Bureau of the State Department is a pretty small bureau. We work closely with our colleagues at our embassies in these countries, and we did some really good things. One of the really difficult things was working on energy security, and this raises the issues of energy security in Europe, especially, and the disagreements we've had with some European member states, and I think what is fair to say is the inconsistency in our policy approach a little bit. The high policy was, Nord Stream 2 is bad for Europe, it's bad for the United States. But underneath that, it wasn't always clear to our partners overseas where we stood and what the consequences of that.
I think that's also an interesting tension between the role of diplomats and international fora, international agreements on the one hand, and on the other hand, the role of domestic policymaking, legislators, Congress, and the U.S. obviously, and so on, in terms of advancing international climate objectives. Right? How do you see that tension playing out in the future? Let's say, to say differently, how effective are international fora, international treaties as an effective driver of change at that level?
Yeah, that's a very important question. We just had COP26, huge step in the direction of aligning the global community towards a shared set of ambitions on climate change. Huge accomplishment, absolutely necessary. I think it was a success. We didn't get everything that we wanted, but there's another one next year. There's another one coming. So these are important things, and I think we need to understand that we're not going to solve everything right away. The harder work, I should say harder work, the complementary work of something like COP26, the Paris Accords, and all of the global agreements that surround them, is the hard work of making that work in individual circumstances. So the way that we accomplish our Paris Club ambitions in the United States is different from the way we're going to accomplish it in Europe. There are lots of commonalities. We're dealing with a lot of the same technologies. We're addressing a lot of the same issues. But the way we actually make that work in the European setting as opposed to an American setting are different. Not that much different, because we share so many common values between the United States and Europe. Our economies are so much alike. There's so much interaction coordination that goes on between our businesses, our governments, and the like. More difficult is in countries where the challenges are much higher. And this, I think, is an important role for U.S. international engagement. It's not just the State Department. It's the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, and others, USAID, to do this, and we work together on this. But it's essentially taking these global commitments, these ambitions that we set for ourselves, and working with an individual country or a grouping of countries and helping them find a solution that works for them. So in an earlier conversation, we were talking about energy access in Africa, huge issue. It's not an issue in the United States. It's not much of an issue in Europe. There are pockets, I guess, in the Balkans where this might be a bit of an issue. But it's an enormous issue in Africa. And so the solution to meeting our climate change ambitions in the United States may not be the same solution that works in sub-Saharan Africa, where they really do need a solution that not only keeps them on track for carbon neutrality, but it also solves this puzzle of supplying affordable and reliable energy to all of their citizens. And there are millions of people in Africa who don't have that. because of that, their quality of life is much poorer than ours. Their access to education, to information, to good health care is impeded quite a bit. And so that's where I see a really important role for people like the Energy Bureau and the State Department is we look at the individual circumstances and try and help those countries come up with a solution that works best for them.
So in other words, not only are international fora effective, so they're necessary to, I think, in the global fight against climate change. And it's interesting because let me refer back to previous programs we've had to get the Washington Foreign Law Society, where we've discussed, for example, the role of international fora and international policymaking in the context of fighting cybercrime. Right, there are certain challenges that are so global, that are so vast in their scope that they need some sort of international engagement, and obviously diplomats in that space play an essential role, even vis-a-vis, for example, domestic policymakers. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have any interesting anecdotes you'd like to share of how hard it is to be, negotiating the terms of agreements, or negotiating, let's say, matters of principle with foreign counterparts on questions of this scale?
Yeah. So I wasn't involved in the COP26 negotiations, Paris Accord negotiations. I have lots of colleagues who have lots of really great war stories about that. Really very difficult, but I really do want to make sure that I'm clear about agreeing with you that these international agreements are so fundamentally important, because despite sometimes our cynicism about how governments operate, we all take these agreements very seriously. And for governments to openly break with these agreements or not comply is a really difficult thing to do. I mean, our withdrawal from the Paris Accords was a huge issue. And we're back in.
It goes back to the soft power conversation we were also having earlier.
Right, yeah, yep, exactly. So these international agreements are really important. My one experience of actually negotiating it, it's not really an international agreement, but was at NATO. So the Wales Summit was after Russia's invasion, taking of Crimea, and fostered this conflict in eastern Ukraine. There were a number of really important issues that we were trying to build consensus on in NATO to address these issues and other issues. Cyber issues were another important issue. Obviously, we were still talking about Afghanistan because it was a NATO operation. There were a huge array of issues that, when we first sat down, it wasn't 100% clear that we had agreement. We spent about there's a very formal system there to prepare for summits, where people at my level at the time spend 30 or 40 days working on the communique. So as our governments are talking to each other and working things out, we're also working to put them on paper. And this goes on every day for a month. And then you go off, and in this case, we went to Wales, and for a day or two before the actual summit, they put us in the basement. And you don't leave until you finish it up, where everybody agrees on the wording, and it's very important. It was a fascinating process to be involved in. Now, I have to say, it's much easier than doing something in the UN system, because we're NATO allies. We agree on the fundamentals of our values and things like that. Nevertheless, there's a lot of disagreements about how we actually do that. But it was challenging, it was tiring, but it was really very interesting to negotiate something like that. 129 paragraphs of getting the wording exactly right, where everybody in the alliance could sign off on it. And it wasn't just the people around the table that I was working with, it was, of course, the governments who had to sign off on it. And we weren't actually ready to deliver that until like 2 minutes before the end of the actual summit. we were down to comments and things, but it was fascinating. And maybe what struck me the most was I negotiated more of my own government than I did with the morale, which is sort of an interesting thing. My negotiating skills were more important talking back to Washington than sitting there in Brussels.
Related to the question of climate change is, of course, the question of the energy transition, and so the ways that we are going to get to a world, right, that is decarbonized, and obviously that will bring consequences on the international stage, and I'm wondering what your views on how the U.S. will, in what shape the U.S. will be during the transition, how well placed the U.S. is to benefit from it, and how the international order will be shaped by these massive changes that are taking place.
Yeah, difficult question, but it is the important question. This is an enormous undertaking, and I look at just at the United States economy to accomplish our goals for transition. It's going to reorder a fundamental reordering of our domestic economy, how the economy works, the winners and losers in the economy, how we train people for the jobs in this new economy. It's enormous, and it's not just government policies. It's not just our companies. It's regulation. It's a whole slew of things. It's hard, and so I don't think that we right now can say here's what it's going to look like. Here's the 15 things we need to do. We get those accomplished. 2050 will come around and we'll be here for us. Because we don't really understand. I mean, it's just like anything in economic policy. Governments put in place an economic policy hoping that the economists are telling them the truth and it's going to work out a certain way. It never really does. There are unintended consequences. Things happen out in the world or elsewhere that change that. So it's not a science yet. So, and this is so much bigger than just changing our economic policy. So there are huge issues out there. We were just talking about the issue of energy access in Africa. That's a big one, and we need to find a way to solve that. I think that a lot of the answers, as I've been saying, aren't really known, but people are working on it. And there are answers that are coming up now that we wouldn't have expected 10 years ago. So, the work on hydrogen, the work on fusion energy, which you and I have talked about. I mean, there's really exciting things going on. Energy efficiency, the cost competitiveness of renewable energy sources like wind and solar now that we wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago. And there are going to be new innovations because this is such an important, thorough kind of change in how we do things. Companies are gonna focus their innovative energies on solving these issues, because if you can come up with a solution to some of these issues, you're going to be a profitable company. And there's a lot of money to be made. So I think that our researchers, our universities, our companies, and our governments are going to be adjusting, and we're going to have to take a fresh look at where we are and what we need to do, because the components of that equation are going to change. There may be a new technological advance that we hadn't foreseen that changes the way that equation comes out, and changes how we have to do things, or maybe makes it easier or more difficult. I don't know. So there's a lot of difficulty. Let me raise one issue on a political level that I think might present some issues, which is as the demand for oil and gas, traditional hydrocarbons in our energy mix declines, especially on petroleum, this is going to drive a lot of high-cost producers out of the market. They're not going to be competitive for a declining demand for petroleum. At some point, do we get back to a case where you've got 4 or 5 countries that are the remaining producers of petroleum? And all of a sudden, they have a tremendous amount of market power that we don't necessarily see now. Now we have OPEC and OPEC Plus that do some of this. But this will actually lead to perhaps a dramatic change in OPEC, because a lot of these member countries are going to be losers in this transition. They're going to be higher cost producers who lose out. How do you keep OPEC together if one of your member countries is no longer able to competitively produce petroleum? So there's a big issue there, and it comes down to a political issue. You know, we're looking at all these supply chain issues in the global economy right now. Well, we dealt with supply chain issues with petroleum in the past. The Arab oil embargo in the 1970s, you know, was a huge disruption and did tremendous damage to our economies in the West, in Europe and the United States. Oil prices went up. We were shortages of fuel. Is there a risk that something like that could happen again? I don't know, but that issue is going to get closer and closer as we get closer to 2050. Because we look at the IEA's projections or others' projections of how much oil and gas we will be or should be using by the time we get to 2050. It's a fraction of what we're using now. It's not going away, of course, but it's a fraction of what we do now. The United States will probably continue to produce oil for its domestic consumption. There are a lot of other countries that will do that, but there'll still be this global petroleum market. And if you only have a small number of producers, that presents an element of risk we haven't really had to deal with in this way for a long time.
As we transition towards the final part of our session today, thank you, obviously, for being with us and for the insightful remarks. There's one question from the audience that I wanted to ask. One of our participants says, I would love to hear about the U.S. government's policies regarding funding joint initiatives to deal with climate adaptation, in addition to financing, in addition to mitigation, adaptation being one of the components of the Paris Agreement. Do you have any views on that, being more of a transitional, of course, approach?
This is an area of climate change that I don't know that much about, but I think the obvious answer is we're already facing challenges of adaptation. We've had changes in our weather. This is going to affect crops. It's going to affect livestock and those kinds of things. It's going to affect, you know, our economies, our industries in ways that we don't fully understand. And I'm not just talking about, you know, losing coastline and flooding cities. That's a huge economic disruption. You know, you look at the projections for how some people project what would happen to New York City. I mean, I can't imagine half of New York City being underwater. But I think there are lots of smaller adaptations that we're already having to address. And what I worry about is that we think that we can just adapt to these changes and we'll just live in a high carbonized atmosphere where the average temperature of the Earth is 3 or 4 degrees higher, and we can adapt. We're a highly advanced technological society. We can adapt. I think that's foolishness. I don't think there are many people that think that, but it does worry me that this is the kind of thing where, you know, well, we don't have to worry about meeting those Paris goals because we can adapt. But the challenge is going to be there are things. The temperature of the Earth is going to continue to increase, even if we do our best on the climate change goals, even if we really, and hopefully we'll begin to bring them back down a little bit. So there are going to be issues that maybe we don't fully understand now that we're going to have to introduce adaptation policies and technologies to address them, just to protect the lives and well-being of our citizens, to protect our cities, to the waterways, fresh water. This is an issue that frequently comes up when we talk about energy is water. And there are increasing areas on the Earth where there is water stress and water scarcity. that's a huge problem. And if climate change makes that worse, which I think is the expectation, how do we address that? That's going to be a very difficult issue. You know, glaciers in certain critical areas of the world are shrinking. Just put them back together again. So how do you adapt to that when you have large populations of people dependent on the water sources? So yeah, adaptation doesn't make the headlines all that much, but I think that it's something that is unavoidable, even if we're very successful on our climate change transition.
To summarize what we've been talking about, there are known challenges, there are unknown challenges, and across the board, I think there will still be an important part to be played by multilateralism and by engagement by international stakeholders through diplomats as yourself. Obviously, the more involved, I think, the better in that kind of situation. We only have about, I think, 5 minutes left actually 7 minutes left to our session. We've been looking back a lot at your career, you know, what's been going on in terms of international policymaking and international treaties. Maybe let's take a peek at the future for now, and then you're in a much different position now than you were since October 2021. But what do you expect going forward from the global community in your field, the field of international energy diplomacy, in order to address the threats of climate change and the challenges that are ahead?
Yeah. I'm not sure I can predict what I expect, but I'll give you what I hope for. And I hope that this cooperation that we're building, addressing a common threat to all of our countries, to humanity, to the way we live, the quality of our lives, that we're more and more finding agreement on this. And not just agreement on the facts of the issue, because that's been a big argument for a couple decades now. Is it real or not? I think that argument has been settled by and large. But then our shared responsibility to address this. So this is the age-old question of externalities or global commons or what you want to call it. You know, if I in country X don't change what I'm doing, and I don't have to spend a lot of money addressing climate change in my little country, the impact on the global climate ambitions is going to be small. So I'm going to be the free rider. And this is always the problem. And what I see is you don't have a lot of that free rider mentality from countries. You do have countries that are raising important questions. So one of them is, well, you know, the modern industrial countries, especially Europe and the United States, got to pollute the world for a century or two, and now you're telling us we can't follow that same model of development. It's too late for that. It's just not possible. So I think that Paris Club and some of the important decisions that COP are trying to address that it is an international responsibility, that we all, in our own economies, address these issues in a common way with common goals, and that there's some economies, there's some countries that need extra help, and that's also our shared global responsibility. So that's a really important thing. I think there's a broad consensus in that, and it's necessary, because otherwise you don't overcome this issue of free riders and externalities. It's just sort of basic principles there. And so I think we've made good progress on that. I'm excited that the United States is back taking the leadership role on climate change. Obviously, you know, as the largest economy in the world, it wouldn't happen without us, for good or ill. But I'm hopeful. I see a lot of really exciting things happening in the world. There's a lot of dangerous things going on, but I studied history as an undergrad, and you know, you can push your finger on a date in human history, and there are a lot of bad things going on just about every time in history. we have better ways to address those than we've had in the past. We're not always very good at picking the best solutions, but I am optimistic that our future is going to be brighter. But we have to solve this issue of climate change. Maybe if we do a good job at it, it'll be a lesson for humanity going forward that we actually do better when we work together.
Well, a dash of optimism there, I think, is always welcome, and I think we can end it on that note. I think it's a very good note to end the conversation on, Mr. Kurt Donnelly. Thank you so much for being with us here, and hopefully you'll be with the Washington Foreign Law Society again.
Sure.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and stay tuned for more events from the Society. Thank you and have a great evening.